For an entire week, not a single person inside the building knew that the man mopping the lobby floor each morning was the billionaire CEO who had quietly returned to the company he built from nothing. They walked past him. They issued orders at him. One of them laughed at the scuffed shoes poking out beneath his uniform. But in a tower full of hundreds of employees, one young trainee always smiled when she saw him coming. She picked up his mop when it clattered to the floor. She left a warm meal outside the supply closet on the night she thought he hadn't eaten. What she could not have known was this: the life she was living was about to change forever. Not because of luck, not because of fate, but because kindness, quiet and stubborn, and entirely unremarkable, has a way of being seen even when no one is looking. Ethan Cole was 42 years old and had not taken a vacation in 11 years. He had founded Meridian Technologies in a rented office above a dry cleaning shop. Back when he was sleeping 4 hours a night and living on gas station coffee, and a belief so unreasonable it bordered on delusion. 20 years later, Meridian occupied the top 14 floors of the tallest commercial tower in the city, employed over 4,000 people across 6 countries, and was valued at a number that made financial journalists reach instinctively for superlatives. Ethan had been on the cover of 3 national magazines. He had shaken hands with senators and sat across dinner tables from foreign dignitaries who wanted something from him. He had everything a person could be told to want. And lately, he had been waking at 3 in the morning with a feeling he could not name, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment and wondering when exactly the company he loved had started to feel like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The reports that crossed his desk were immaculate. Every quarter, the internal satisfaction surveys came back polished and optimistic, filled with carefully worded responses that said exactly the right things. And yet the numbers told a different story. In the past 18 months, employee turnover had climbed 22%. 3 senior engineers had resigned in the same week without providing the standard 2-week notice. Exit interview summaries, which his assistant compiled into a single page, used phrases like cultural misalignment and lack of psychological safety language, so sanitized it told him nothing at all. He started asking questions. The answers he got were smooth and plausible, and almost certainly incomplete. People did not tell the truth to men who signed their paychecks. That was a fact he had understood intellectually for years, but only recently had he begun to feel the weight of it. The idea came to him not from a business book or a consultant's presentation, but from a memory. A story his father once told him about walking the factory floor in disguise to understand what the workers were actually experiencing. His father had been a foreman at a manufacturing plant, not an executive, and the gesture had been small, but the lesson had stayed. Ethan mentioned the idea once, casually, to his personal assistant, Marcus, who looked at him with an expression that suggested he was hearing something both brilliant and mildly alarming. By the following Monday, the logistics were arranged. A temporary identity, a uniform requisitioned from building services, a name Ben chosen for no particular reason, except that it sounded unremarkable. Only Marcus and the head of corporate security, a man named Victor, knew the truth. Everyone else would see what they expected to see. A middle-aged janitor doing his rounds. Ethan stood in front of the bathroom mirror on Sunday evening and appraised the transformation without sentimentality. He had let his stubble grow in uneven. He had swapped his contacts for a pair of scratched wire-rimmed glasses he found in the back of a drawer. The uniform was gray and slightly too large in the shoulders, the kind of garment designed to make the person wearing it invisible. He looked tired. He looked ordinary. He looked, he thought, like a man no one would bother to remember. He turned off the light and went to bed early for the first time in months. The first morning, he arrived at 6:45 and took the service elevator. The doors opened onto the back corridor of the 23rd floor, and he stepped out with a mop cart and a supply bag and the practiced, unhurried movement of a man who knew exactly where he was going. A pair of early arriving analysts passed him in the hallway without slowing. One was on the phone. The other glanced at the cart with the vague irritation of someone who has had to navigate around an obstacle. Neither said good morning. Ethan pushed the cart forward and began his shift. By the end of that first day, he had learned several things. He had learned that the pantry on the 26th floor was used as an overflow meeting space in the afternoons, meaning the cleaning that was supposed to happen at 2 o'clock got pushed back to whenever the last group of people decided to leave, which was sometimes 6, sometimes 7, sometimes later. He had learned that the men's restroom on the 25th floor had a sensor light that turned off after 90 seconds if no motion was detected, meaning anyone in a stall longer than that was plunged into sudden darkness, a problem that had apparently existed for at least 3 months, based on the post-it note someone had taped to the inside of the door. He had learned that a significant portion of the people who worked for him did not say thank you. Not to him, not to the other building services staff. He occasionally worked alongside, not in any observable way that suggested the thought had crossed their minds. He mopped. He emptied bins. He wiped down surfaces. He was, for all practical purposes, furniture. On the second day, a young manager, blonde, early 30s, the kind of man who owned 3 blazers in slightly different shades of the same blue, came out of a meeting room and nearly walked into the mop cart. He looked at the cart, then at Ethan, with an expression of displaced irritation, as though the object and the person operating it had both chosen a bad moment to exist. He said, without breaking stride, that this area needed to be cleaned before 11, not during. He was already on his phone before the sentence was finished. Ethan looked at him. He did not say anything. He moved the cart 6 inches to the left and continued mopping. Later in the same afternoon, 2 analysts stood by the elevator bank discussing a colleague who had recently been promoted over one of them. They spoke at a normal conversational volume, as if the man pushing the cart nearby were a piece of ambient noise, rather than a human being capable of comprehension. One of them said something about the new project lead being decorative but not intelligent. The other laughed. A pair of them from the strategy team passed at 5 minutes to 3 and one said to the other, loudly enough for anyone within 10 feet to hear, that someone should tell the cleaning staff about the concept of efficiency. The other laughed. Ethan pushed the cart around the corner and kept going. He had expected some of this. He had not expected the completeness of it, the degree to which invisibility, once assigned, became self-reinforcing. People's eyes slid past him with the practiced smoothness of long habit. He was part of the visual background of the building, like the potted plants in the lobby, or the motivational typography on the feature walls present, acknowledged at some peripheral level, but never actually registered as a thing requiring a response. A woman in the finance department, when he arrived to empty the bin beside her desk, shifted her chair slightly without looking up, creating just enough space for him to reach the bin, and nothing more. That was the full extent of the acknowledgement. When he was done, she shifted the chair back. The transaction was complete. He had been optimally processed. On the third morning, something changed. He was crouching beside the recycling station near the elevator banks on the 24th floor, sorting a tangle of improperly discarded materials, when he heard footsteps that stopped beside him rather than flowing past. He looked up. A young woman stood there, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back and a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. She was holding a paper coffee cup in both hands like it was something she needed to steady herself with. She looked directly at him, not through him, not past him, and she smiled. It was not a pitying smile. It was the uncomplicated smile of someone who saw another person and found the sight of them entirely acceptable. "Good morning," she said. He blinked. "Morning," he said. She nodded and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Ethan stayed crouched by the recycling station for a moment longer than necessary. Her name, he found out, was Lily Carter. She was a marketing trainee. 3 months into a 6-month placement, she had a small desk near the window on the 24th floor. And she arrived each morning before most of her colleagues and stayed most evenings after many of them had gone. He observed this gradually, the way you observe weather patterns not through concentrated study but through repeated exposure to the same conditions. She said good morning to the security guard at the lobby desk. She said good morning to the woman at the reception window. She said good morning to him. Every day. Without fail. Without the slight downward flicker of the eyes that most people performed instinctively when addressing someone they had unconsciously categorized as service staff. On the 4th day, he dropped the mop. He had been reaching across the cart to adjust the solution bottle, and the handle slipped, clattering against the tile floor with a sound that made two nearby executives flinch and look over with expressions of mild displeasure. Lily, who had been walking past with a folder pressed to her chest, stopped immediately and crouched down to retrieve it. She handed it back to him handle first. "Those things are heavier than they look," she said, as if this were simply a true and interesting fact, and not a small mercy. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Of course," and continued walking. He stood holding the mop and watched her go. That evening he sat in his car in the parking structure for 20 minutes before driving home. He was trying to identify the feeling that had settled in his chest somewhere around the fourth-floor pantry and had not left. It was not sentiment exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the particular sensation of being reminded that a thing you had half forgotten still existed in the world. Lily Carter had grown up in a town 300 miles south of the city, in a house where the furnace worked intermittently and the kitchen table had one leg held up by a folded piece of cardboard. Her mother cleaned offices at night. Her father had left when she was 9. She had worked her way through college on a combination of scholarships, weekend shifts at a diner, and a discipline that most people her age didn't have to develop because they hadn't yet needed to. The Meridian traineeship had been the thing she'd applied for with the particular hope of someone who has learned not to want too much carefully, at arm's length, with a hedge already built into the expectation. When the acceptance email arrived, she had read it 3 times before allowing herself to believe it was real. She had moved to the city with 2 suitcases and a month's worth of savings, and found a room in a shared apartment 40 minutes from the office by bus. Inside Meridian, she was assigned to the marketing team under the supervision of the department director, a man named Daniel Ross. Daniel was 38 and had the particular confidence of someone who had risen primarily by making sure the right people noticed his victories and the wrong people were blamed for his failures. He dressed well, he spoke well. In presentations to senior leadership, he was polished and decisive and conveyed an impression of authority that was convincing enough to have gone largely unquestioned for 5 years. With the people below him, he was something else. He assigned interns the work that would not be credited. He dismissed ideas in meetings before they were finished being spoken. He had a gift for small, deniable humiliations, the comment delivered with a smile, the correction made in front of an audience, the suggestion that someone's contribution was appreciated while making clear through tone alone that it had not been. Lily had understood this within 2 weeks. She had also understood, just as quickly, that saying so out loud would accomplish nothing good. The lowest point of the week came on the 5th day, in the hallway outside the main conference room on the 25th floor, 20 minutes before a scheduled client presentation. Ethan was mopping the section of floor near the door. The carpet inside would be handled after the meeting, but the tile corridor needed to be done before the clients arrived. He was halfway through the section when Daniel Ross came out of the conference room with his phone in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other, talking loudly to someone on speaker, and walked directly into the cart with the focused-in attention of a man who had never once had to navigate around anything he didn't want to navigate around. A long arc of dark liquid caught the corridor tile and splashed against the side of Ethan's shoe. Daniel looked down at the spill. He looked at the shoe. He looked at Ethan. There was a beat of silence in which Daniel made a decision that was more revealing than he knew. He said, with the clipped briskness of a man who considered the outcome to be entirely the fault of whoever had placed the cart in his path, that the floor needed to be cleaned. Now, before the clients arrived in 15 minutes, he said it needed to be spotless. He said it in a voice that contained the specific cadence of a man who had said similar things to similar people many times before and found the experience without consequence. Then he turned and went back through the conference room door without looking at the spill again. Ethan crouched down with the mop and began. Lily came around the corner of the corridor 30 seconds later, heading toward the meeting with a folder under her arm, and stopped when she saw him kneeling on the floor. She set the folder down on the windowsill and reached for one of the extra cloths on the lower rack of the cart. She said nothing. She simply crouched down and helped. Daniel came back out of the conference room a moment later, looking for something he'd left on the windowsill. He saw Lily on the floor. He looked at her the way he looked at most things that didn't immediately make sense to him, With a particular flatness of expression, that was his version of contempt. He said, in front of 3 colleagues who had followed him out of the room and were now standing in the corridor watching, that he was curious whether Lily was aware that her traineeship was in marketing and not in building services. There was a pause. One of the 3 colleagues made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Lily looked up. She said she was aware. She said the floor needed to be cleaned before the clients arrived, and she was in a position to help, so she was helping. She said it without heat, without apology, with the calm self-possession of someone who had calculated the cost of the statement and decided it was worth it. Daniel looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being answered when he expects compliance. Then he took what he'd come back for and went inside. Ethan remained crouching by the floor. He did not look up. He did not need to. She did not stop being kind because the environment discouraged it. This was what Ethan found most striking as the week continued. She did not adopt the armor that most people constructed in workplaces like this, the studied indifference, the slight hardening of expression, the careful withdrawal of warmth from anyone who couldn't help her. She thanked people. She apologized when she bumped into someone. She held the elevator. She was not naive about where she was or what it required. She simply chose not to let the requirements of the environment edit the person she was when no one important was watching. On the 5th morning, Ethan arrived to find an unfamiliar bag sitting outside the supply closet on the lower service level, the closet he used as a staging area for cleaning supplies, and where he sometimes ate his lunch when the building cafeteria felt too exposed. The bag was a plain paper sack. Inside was a container of fried rice, still warm, wrapped in a rubber band to keep the lid on. There was a note written on a torn piece of notepad paper in handwriting that was small and precise and slightly tilted. "Eat something proper, okay? L." He stood in the corridor, holding the bag for a long moment. No one had brought him food in years. People sent him gift baskets. People took him to restaurants. People invited him to dinners where the purpose was networking and the meal was incidental. But no one had ever wrapped a container of rice in a rubber band and left it outside a supply closet with a handwritten note out of the simple, unadorned belief that he might not have had a proper meal. He ate the rice sitting on an upturned cleaning bucket. It was very good. He folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He did not examine the impulse to keep it. He just kept it. The crisis came on the 6th day, and it came from a direction Ethan had not fully anticipated. He had expected to find evidence of the managerial dysfunction that the exit surveys had hinted at. He had expected cultural problems, communication failures, the ordinary entropy of a large organization that had grown faster than its internal practices could accommodate. He had not expected fraud, but there it was, not buried, not cleverly concealed, sitting in plain sight for anyone who knew where to look. Lily had found it first. The company was preparing to close a major partnership agreement with a regional logistics firm, a deal that had been in negotiation for months and was scheduled for signing at the end of the quarter. The marketing team had been tasked with producing a performance report demonstrating Meridian's campaign ROI data to support the partnership terms. The data, Lily discovered on the afternoon of the 5th day while cross-referencing source files as part of a routine task she'd been assigned, did not match. Specific metrics in the client-facing version of the report had been adjusted, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious at a glance, but adjusted nonetheless. Numbers that should have read a certain way had been altered to read better. The discrepancy was small enough to be invisible to anyone not doing the specific comparison she happened to be doing, and large enough, if discovered later, to constitute a serious misrepresentation to a business partner. She sat with this information for the rest of the afternoon. She was not sure who had made the changes. She was not entirely sure what the right course of action was. She knew what the wrong course of action looked like: say nothing, submit the report, collect her stipend, finish the traineeship, write a polished reference request to someone who would not remember her name. She also knew that the right course of action had a cost attached to it that she could not accurately calculate in advance. She found Ben in the service corridor, near the elevators that evening, finishing a final pass with the mop before end of shift. She said she needed to talk to someone, and she wasn't sure why she was talking to him specifically. and he said that was all right. And she sat down on the edge of a supply cart and told him what she'd found. She did not dress it up or dramatize it. She was precise and careful and a little frightened. When she had finished, he asked her a question. He asked, if reporting this cost her the traineeship, what would she do? She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would find another job. She said she would rather start over than finish something she knew she had finished dishonestly. She said she had worked too hard to get here to leave here as someone she wouldn't respect. Her voice did not waver. He nodded. She left. He stood in the corridor with the mop in his hands and felt something rearranging itself quietly in the architecture of his chest. The next morning, Lily submitted a formal written report to the compliance office. She had spent the night writing it. She detailed the discrepancy carefully, attached the source files, and noted that she was uncertain of the chain of responsibility, but believed the information needed to be reviewed before the partnership signing. By 10 o'clock, Daniel Ross had been informed. By 11, he had identified Lily as the source of the report and had begun the process of constructing an alternate account of events, one in which Lily had misunderstood the data, had acted impulsively without consulting her supervisor, had created a compliance issue where none existed, and had, in doing so, jeopardized a partnership that the entire department had worked months to secure. The account was delivered in a meeting Lily was not invited to. By noon, she had been called into a separate meeting with two people from the HR department, one of whom slid a termination form across the table and explained that her traineeship was being concluded effective immediately due to conduct inconsistent with team collaboration standards. She did not argue. She signed what she was required to sign. She asked if she could return to her desk to collect her belongings and was told she could have 15 minutes. She put her notebooks and her charger and a small potted cactus she had brought from home into her canvas tote bag. She did not cry at the desk. She would cry later, on the bus, with her forehead against the window, the city sliding past outside in the gray afternoon light. But not at the desk, not where anyone could see. She took the service elevator down because it was slower, and she did not want to stand in a lobby full of people right now. It stopped on the lower level. She stepped out. She walked to the supply closet. She knocked on the half-open door. Ethan was inside, reorganizing a shelf of cleaning solution bottles, and he turned. She held out a small key, a building access card for the service areas that Marcus had arranged for her weeks ago because she sometimes helped him carry supplies from the loading dock. She said she was sorry she wouldn't be able to bring him lunch anymore. She said she hoped he would eat properly. She said he was a good man. She left before he could answer. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, and then there was silence. Ethan stood in the supply closet with the access card in his hand, and the silence pressing in around him, and he stayed very still for a long time. Then he reached for his phone. He called Marcus. He said 3 sentences. He put the phone back in his pocket. He hung the uniform jacket on its hook, walked to the service elevator, pressed the button for the executive floor, and went to work. The next morning was a Thursday. The board meeting had been scheduled for weeks, a routine quarterly update. The kind of meeting that ran to a prepared agenda and produced no surprises. It started at 9. At 9:14, the door at the back of the conference room opened, and a man in a gray building services uniform walked in, pushing nothing, carrying nothing, moving with the particular unhurried quality of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was prepared to take their time getting there. 3 people at the table looked up with expressions of confusion shading into irritation. One of them, a senior vice president named Martin, said with measured condescension that this room was currently occupied. The man in the uniform removed his glasses. He stood up slightly straighter. Victor, the head of corporate security, who had been standing just inside the door, straightened as well and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Ethan Cole." The silence that followed was not an ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room full of people simultaneously revising an enormous number of assumptions. Daniel Ross, who had arrived early and taken a seat near the center of the table, went the particular shade of still that a person goes when they realize the ground beneath them has already moved, and they are only now perceiving the fact of it. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the room. He said he had spent the past 7 days in the building in a capacity that none of them had recognized, and that in that time he had collected a fairly comprehensive record of the working culture they had collectively created. He turned to the screen at the end of the room. The video was not long, 23 minutes of footage edited from a week of observation, but it was thorough. It showed a quorum of behavior that had been normalized to the point of invisibility. The casual dismissals, the petty cruelties, the structural exploitation of people in low-status positions, and, near the end, a clear and documented account of data manipulation in the partnership report. Traced through its revision history to a set of edits made from a computer registered to the marketing director's account. When the video ended, Ethan stood at the front of the room and said something he had been composing in his head since the night before, in the supply closet, with an access card in his hand and the sound of retreating footsteps in his ears. He said he had built this company because he believed that the right way to build something was to make it worth being part of. He said somewhere along the way that belief had been replaced, in large parts of the organization, by a different and uglier set of operating assumptions. He said he accepted responsibility for allowing that to happen under his watch. He also said it was going to stop. Daniel Ross was suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. 2 other managers identified in the footage were placed on administrative leave. The partnership was paused. The compliance office was instructed to begin an independent audit. The board sat and listened and said very little, because there was very little to say. 40 minutes later, Marcus made a phone call to a number Ethan had written on a piece of paper. He told the person who answered that Mr. Cole would like to speak with her and that a car was being sent. The person on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment and then said she didn't understand. Marcus said that was all right and that the driver would be there in 20 minutes. The person said okay, in the tone of someone who has learned that when something does not make immediate sense, it is sometimes better to simply wait and let it become clear. Lily arrived wearing the same coat she'd had on when she left the day before. She had been at home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she was not drinking, staring at a job board on her laptop screen without actually reading it. When the call came, she had changed her shirt. She had not changed anything else. The car brought her to the tower entrance, and a woman Lily didn't recognize escorted her up to the executive floor and through a set of glass doors she had never been through before and into a large conference room where a number of people she recognized from the company's internal directory were already seated. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking stock of the room. Then she looked to the front, where a man in a blue dress shirt was standing with his back to her, looking out over the city through the floor-to-ceiling window. He turned when she came in. She registered the face, the posture, the particular quality of stillness. Then, she registered the context. She put the 2 things together. The sequence of recognition moved across her face with a clarity that, later, several people in the room would independently describe as one of the most quietly affecting things they had ever witnessed. Ethan waited until she had settled into herself again. Then he said, in front of everyone in the room, that in the past week, he had seen a great many things about the culture of his company, most of them disappointing. He said he had also seen something that he wanted to make sure did not go unacknowledged. He said there was one person in the building who had treated him with ordinary human decency on every single one of the 7 days he had spent as someone with no apparent status or power. One person who had said good morning when saying good morning wasn't required. One person who had picked up a mop without being asked. One person who had left a warm meal and a note that said, in handwriting slightly tilted to the right, eat something proper, okay. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced the folded piece of notepad paper. He held it up briefly, not for effect, just to show that it was real, that he had kept it, that it had mattered enough to keep. He said that the same person, when she had found evidence of wrongdoing that could have cost her everything, had chosen to report it anyway. He said that this was not a small thing. He said that this was, in fact, the kind of thing a company should organize itself around. Lily did not speak for a long moment. When she did, she said she didn't know what to say. He said that was fine, and that she didn't have to say anything right now. He told her she was being offered a permanent position with the company, at a level appropriate to her actual capabilities rather than her trainee designation. He told her there was a funded professional development program being established, and that she had been identified as its first recipient. He told her she would be leading a project team starting the following quarter. She said she appreciated that very much, and her voice was even and measured in the way that voices are when the person using them is working hard to keep them that way. Then she said there was something she wanted to ask. She asked if the compliance report she'd submitted had helped. He said it had been essential. She nodded. She looked at her hands. She looked back up at him. She said she was glad. What happened in the months that followed did not happen all at once, because the things that matter rarely do. The audit completed its work. The investigation concluded. Daniel Ross did not return. Several of the managers who had appeared in the video footage were either dismissed or moved to roles without supervisory responsibility. The partnership negotiation was reopened with corrected data. And after a delay of 6 weeks, it concluded successfully, on terms that were slightly less favorable on paper than the previous version, and substantially more defensible in every way that actually mattered. The human resources policies were rewritten. A new internal reporting mechanism was established, one that allowed employees to raise concerns without their identities being disclosed. Town hall meetings were instituted, monthly, where Ethan sat in a room with groups of 20 or 30 employees from across the organization and listened, not presented, not delivered, prepared remarks. Listened. It was uncomfortable at first for everyone involved, including him. It became, over time, something he looked forward to. The people who had been most visibly cruel during the week of the undercover observation were not the only ones who faced consequences. The more quietly damaging behavior, the structural exclusions, the systemic disregard for people in lower-level positions, the culture of deference and performance that had replaced actual honesty, those were harder to address and took longer to change. Ethan hired an organizational development consultant who spent 4 months interviewing employees across every department and every pay grade. The report that came back was long and uncomfortable, and full of specific, documented examples that he made himself read in full, twice, before he felt he was ready to respond to it adequately. He held 2 all-hands meetings, in which he read selected portions of the report aloud to the full company. He did not editorialize. He did not soften the language. He said, "Here is what some of your colleagues experienced while working here." And he stood at the front of the room and let the silence do what silence does after a truth has been spoken into it. Lily learned the job with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything else. She was not flashy. She did not move through the office with the performed confidence of someone trying to signal arrival. She asked questions when she didn't understand something. She gave credit explicitly and without resentment. She was the kind of manager, the kind she became within a year, leading a team of 8 who noticed when someone was struggling and addressed it directly and privately, rather than letting it compound into a larger problem. The people who worked with her mentioned, consistently, that they felt like she actually saw them. This was not described as an unusual quality. It was described as simply what she was like. But, in the context of Meridian's culture, as it had previously functioned, it registered as extraordinary. The relationship between Ethan and Lily did not develop quickly, because neither of them rushed it. What existed between them in those first months was something quieter and more careful, a mutual regard that had been established in unusual circumstances, and that both of them understood was worth not treating carelessly. They had coffee, occasionally, in the building cafeteria. They spoke at meetings. He asked for her input on the culture initiative, and she gave it directly, without deferring to his seniority or moderating her opinions to match what she thought he wanted to hear. This, he found, was one of the things he valued most about her. It was difficult to overstate how rare it was, at his level, to be told something true. There was an afternoon in late autumn, about 8 months after the board meeting, when Ethan came down to the main floor of the building and found Lily standing near the lobby, talking to the 2 women from building services who cleaned the first-floor common areas each morning. She was laughing at something one of them had said. She remembered their names. She asked one of them how her daughter's school play had gone. The other one was telling a story with her hands, something animated and funny. And Lily was listening with the quality of someone who was genuinely present in the moment and found the world, even in its small ordinariness, worth paying attention to. Ethan stood back from the conversation, by the elevator bank, and watched for a moment without intruding. He felt, standing there, the particular settling sensation of a man who has recently learned something important about what he values and is now seeing the evidence of it clearly, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon. 1 year after the week he had spent as Ben, the building was different in ways that were not always visible in the metrics, but were nonetheless real and worth noting. People held doors. The cafeteria was louder at lunch because people were actually talking to each other, not performing the presence of social engagement, but genuinely occupying the same space and finding it worthwhile. The service staff, the cleaning crew, the facilities team, the people who maintained the infrastructure that the rest of the building depended on without thinking about, were addressed by name, more often than before. By more people than before. Not by everyone, not perfectly, but more. The internal satisfaction surveys, which were now administered by an independent firm rather than the internal HR team, returned numbers that Ethan did not simply trust, but was able to cross-reference against turnover data, absenteeism rates, and the volume of the internal reporting submissions, all of which told a consistent and encouraging story. Lily was presenting to a group of new marketing trainees on a Tuesday morning, in the glass-walled meeting room on the 24th floor, when a young man at the back of the group, nervous, slightly too eager, wearing a shirt that was newer than the rest of his clothes, reached across the table for a glass of water and knocked it directly into his own lap, gasping, sending water across the table and onto the floor around him. He went absolutely rigid, with the specific mortification of a person who has made a spectacular, visible error on what was functionally their first day. The other trainees around him went very still in the way that groups of people go still when witnessing someone else's embarrassment and are deciding collectively whether to make it worse. He looked at the floor. He looked at Lily. His face said everything a face can say when words are unavailable. Lily set down her presentation notes without hurry. She picked up the nearest cloth from the supply table at the edge of the room and handed it to him without ceremony, and said something to him in a low voice that made him exhale. Then she crouched down and began cleaning up the spill from the floor herself, matter-of-factly, as if this were simply a thing that needed doing and she was there and so she would do it. The door opened, and Ethan came in. He had been on his way to a meeting on the floor above, and had knocked to ask Lily a question about a document. He took in the scene in a second, picked up a second cloth from the table, and crouched down beside her. Together they cleaned up the water without making it a production. The trainee, whose name was Marcus, same as the assistant, looked at the two of them, the woman leading the session he'd been terrified of, and the man he now recognized as the company's founder, both kneeling on the floor of the conference room with cleaning cloths in their hands, and he said, genuinely bewildered, that they didn't need to do that. Ethan straightened up. He handed the cloth to a passing colleague, thanked them, and looked at the trainee. He said that every job done well deserves to be treated as worth doing. Ethan straightened up. He handed the cloth to a passing colleague, thanked them, and looked at the trainee. He said that every job done well deserves to be treated as worth doing. Then, he said he hoped the rest of the session went well, nodded to Lily, and went to his meeting. Lily looked at the trainee, who still appeared slightly dazed, his shirt still damp, his mortification beginning the long, slow process of becoming a story he would tell years from now. She said it was all right. She said that in her experience, the days that started badly had a way of being the ones you remembered the longest. And that being remembered was not the worst thing. She said sometimes the most useful thing you learned in a place was something that had nothing to do with the official curriculum. She said, let's keep going. And they did. That evening, the lights in the building stayed on later than usual. There was a quarter-end report being prepared, and several teams were working past 7. Ethan had a habit, developed over the past year, of walking the floors in the late evening the way you might walk the perimeter of a house before sleeping, not looking for anything in particular, just checking that things were in order, that the rooms were full of the right quality of activity. He came out of the stairwell on the 24th floor and stood for a moment looking through the glass partition at the cluster of people still at their desks. Some of them glanced up. Some of them waved. One of them held up a coffee mug in a gesture of exaggerated exhaustion that made him smile. He did not feel like a stranger here the way he had once feared he might. He felt, with a clarity that still occasionally surprised him, like a man who belonged to something that was worth belonging to, who had nearly lost it by not looking at it clearly, and had gotten it back by looking at it from the ground up, through scratched wire-rimmed glasses, with a mop in his hands and nothing left to perform. Lily was at her desk at the far corner of the room, hair loose now after a long day, writing something by hand in the notebook she kept for drafting before she moved things to the screen. She looked up when he knocked on the glass. She raised an eyebrow, a question, or possibly a greeting. He raised one in return. She shook her head slightly, which might have meant she was fine, or might have meant she knew exactly what he was doing on his evening walk, and she went back to writing. He went back to the stairwell. He climbed 2 more floors. He looked out at the city through the window at the end of the corridor, the lights going on as the sky went dark, the unbroken, ordinary continuation of the world. He thought about something he had understood during that week in the uniform, something he had been trying to put into words ever since. He thought about the way most people moved through spaces like this one, through offices and corridors and lobbies in a state of partial attention, filtering out the things and people that did not register as immediately relevant to their own purposes. He thought about how easy it was to become invisible, how little it cost to notice someone, how much that noticing could mean to the person being seen. He had spent 20 years building a company. He had spent 1 week learning something about it that no report had been able to tell him. He thought about what it had felt like to be genuinely unseen, not misunderstood, not underestimated, actually invisible. In the way that only certain categories of people become invisible to certain other categories of people. He thought about the woman in the finance department who had shifted her chair without looking up. He thought about the analyst who had spoken at full volume about a colleague in front of a man he'd decided wasn't there. He thought about the young manager in the 3 blue blazers who had turned mid-sentence and walked away without waiting to hear if there was a response. He thought about how none of those people were unusual. None of them were outliers or cautionary examples. They were ordinary people doing the ordinary thing, organizing their attention around what they had been implicitly taught to regard as worth attending to, and letting everything else pass through without resistance or recognition. The building had taught them this. The culture had taught them this. He had not built the culture deliberately, but he had allowed it to grow, and he had benefited from it, and that meant it was his. He had sat in a supply closet on a cleaning bucket and eaten fried rice out of a container, and understood this with a clarity that the corner office with the floor-to-ceiling view had never once produced. The lesson was not complicated. It had been delivered to him by a young woman in a canvas tote bag who made $4 above minimum wage and sent money home to her mother every 2 weeks without fail, and thought to bring a container of fried rice to a man she thought was a janitor because she had noticed, simply noticed, that he hadn't eaten. She had not done this because she expected something from him. She had not done it because it was strategic or calculated or likely to produce a favorable outcome. She had done it because she was a person who paid attention and who believed, in some inarticulate and foundational way, that paying attention to other people was simply part of what it meant to move through the world correctly. That belief had cost her. And then, in the way that the most important things tend to work over a long enough timeline, it had returned to her. Not as a transaction, not as a reward for virtue, administered by a universe keeping careful score, but as the natural consequence of the fact that character, genuine character, tends eventually to be recognized by the people who have the clearest reason to look for it. You don't know who someone truly is until they think it doesn't matter how they treat you, until the person in front of them holds no power, no usefulness, no leverage, until all the incentives that ordinarily shape behavior have been removed, and what remains is just a person deciding, freely and without consequence, who they want to be. That is where character lives. Not in the meeting room. Not in the performance review. In the small, unwatched, entirely voluntary gesture of decency, extended to someone the world has decided, does not need to be noticed. In a warm container of rice. In a note slightly tilted to the right. In the uncomplicated act of looking at another person and finding them entirely worth looking at,